Hello and welcome to Sustain, the podcast where we talk about sustaining open source for the long haul. Who are we? Where did we come from? Where are we going? What time zone is it anyway? Very excited to talk to my guest today. I'm, of course, Richard Littauer, your host today. Hello, everyone. And this is another one of the OSCA podcasts where we talk about the Open Source Community Africa event that happened last June. Now, oddly enough, our guest wasn't at that OSCA, which we'll talk about, but is still definitely a member of Open Source Community Africa. I'm talking today to Subomi Oluwalana, who I probably mispronounced, but I tried very hard. Subomi, how are you doing today?
I'm very well, thank you.
It's great to have you. You're calling in from San Francisco? What are you doing there?
Yes, so I've been here for like 3 weeks now, meeting customers, meeting investors, just doing all company stuff. I flew in from Nigeria just 3 weeks ago. So yes.
Yeah. Subomi is the co-founder and CEO at Convoy. So that makes sense why you're looking for customers and the like. You're the CEO. Tell me what Convoy does.
Yes. So Convoy is an open source webhooks gateway. So I like to describe it as Kong, but for webhooks. So the way you think about Kong, it's a gateway that sits in front of your microservices and routes requests to the right microservice and has all these sort of abstractions like rate limiting, circuit breaking, all that juicy stuff. But the reverse when it comes to webhooks, right? You want a service that can aggregate webhooks from multiple microservices and just send them out and apply the usual, again, circuit breaking, rate limiting, retries, all that juicy stuff. So yes, that's Convoy's open source webhooks gateway.
So it's an open source website. Tell me about the open source model. What are you keeping proprietary? How do you keep advantage in the field? How does open source work?
Yeah, so I had to do a bit of research to sort of figure out how we decide what we open source and what we do not open source. And it's very important for us because we wanted to really be open source, but we also wanted to make money. So I think when you do a bit of research, you sort of land on the buyer-based open core model by GitLab, where the whole idea is who cares about this feature, right? Who cares the most about this feature? Now, the individual developer for us cares about sending webhooks reliably and everything that has to do with their webhook infrastructure. Their managers, on the other hand, care about governance and all that managerial issues. And so we say, okay, we'll go with the buyer-based open core model where what the managers care about would be proprietary, but all the functionality that is required to send webhooks at scale would be open source because we want the individual developer to gain benefit of everything important to sending webhooks. So stuff like retries is important, it's open source. Stuff like rate limiting is important, it's open source. Stuff like webhook transformation is important, it's open source. Stuff like security, SAML, SSO is proprietary.
So tell me about your community. When you say it's important to open source, who are you meaning? You mean like single developers at companies or hobbyists, or what sort of community do you have in the open source world?
I think the entire chain. So when you think of, I actually wrote this in the blog post Why Open Source when we published it in August. Fundamentally, I think about Convoy as an abstraction, right? I think about it like if I reduce it very fundamentally, I think about it like a library. I just want, so I write Rails, right? So I just want to add a gem to my gem file or to my package JSON, just add a single line. It's an abstraction that I need for my day-to-day job as a developer. But for Convoy, it becomes a service where you have to pull a Docker image and deploy it to the environment you want to deploy. So from hobbyists to the developer working in the enterprise or large organizations, we want that technology abstraction to be an abstraction you can depend on to do just anything. That's like one of the fundamental thesis of being open source. Like I have an idea of what I think people should use it for, but I want the developer to think if I want to send an event in form of a webhook, I can use Convoy. And so the open source is available to hobbyists, to enterprise developers, just anybody. In our community today, we have the entire range. We have junior developers working with webhooks for the first time, and we have really senior developers that have been integrating webhooks through Stripe, receiving hundreds of thousands of events every day, trying to figure out the best way to manage this event for dev environment, for production environment, for fan outs. And they have like more interesting use cases. So we are seeing the entire chain from like director of engineering to like new engineers working today with like webhooks.
So I'm really glad you brought up that blog post. You have a section in the blog post called sustainability. I'm going to quote directly from it and then ask you a question. So open source is the ultimate form of sustainability. 92% of SaaS companies fail, regardless of funding or growth. Failure of your business should not bring down my infrastructure, nor force me to redesign my system architecture when I'm not ready to do so. Providing open source software is the highest form of care for sustainability for your users. I love that. So my question, Subomi, is if you're trying to ensure that you are not a blocker in the chain of the sustainability for your open source project, that your business isn't the only thing keeping it alive, how are you also ensuring that you control the product market enough that people want to fund and pay for you? How do you bridge that line between being the person that keeps the thing going, but also not being the person that keeps the thing going?
Yes, it's sort of like a balance that every open source founder will have to think very deeply about. And the sustainability benefits also can work for the company and can work against the company in the sense that if you decide to become the stumbling block, the community can just go ahead and just continue. And we're seeing that already with like OpenTofu and HashiCorp, OpenSearch and Elastic. But I think, in my opinion, this is something everybody has to think very deeply about and sort of come up with like what works best for the project and what works best for the product that you sort of monetize. I came across this idea recently that says there's a difference between the project and the product. And the project is like community growth thing. And then the product is what you sort of monetize on yourself. But I think GitLab has a good idea around this as well. GitLab sort of has a good idea around this in the sense that they have a blog post called their stewardship. I think the important thing in trying to find the balance between not being the stumbling block for the community as well as making money for the business, it's important to be transparent. It's very important to be transparent with the community where the direction you are taking, and do not rock pull the community when you want to make more money. That, I think, in my opinion, is the biggest problem that we have to face in like open source founders. And the general wisdom for the last decade or so has been, do not think very deeply about your community and all these users. Put the software out there and grow. And then when you are very large, just rock through the community and make more money. But now we are seeing that more founders are starting to think very deeply about these things. And from the day one of their businesses, coming with a very clear idea, say, hey, see what we plan to do, and this is where we are taking this to. So I think stewardship is the best way we try to figure out this thing and say, hey, we want to keep this thing for the community, but we also want to make money. And this is how we plan to do it. So we can have this sort of contract, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. When we think about a community for open source, we obviously think about the developers. We also think about the stewards and the companies that are invested in the ecosystem at large. And part of those companies is actually the VC funders. Now, you're part of Y Combinator, which is great. How did you convince the people at Y Combinator that going open source and enabling your stewardship plan was a good idea?
Interesting. Y Combinator has become a good home for open source companies. If you sort of graph the amount of open source companies coming out of White in the last, say, 6 batches, you would see like a upward growth in like open source companies coming out of Y Combinator. You can see the likes of Postdog, for example. There are lots of interesting open source companies coming out of White. So it wasn't really a hard sell. I think that's why it wasn't really a top sell. Again, it's something that I think I'm really excited about. Like if you think 20 years ago, it was very difficult to think open source can be a good business model. What's happening now is more and more companies are proving that this is doable. But there are still challenges, obviously. Like the HashiCorp license change really pained me because I read a lot about their business and I modeled a lot of Convoy about HashiCorp. So there's still a lot we need to learn as an industry, but it wasn't tough. So yeah.
So you're in a seat which is also unique and interesting. There haven't been a ton of Nigerian companies in Y Combinator. Can you tell me about that experience? How did you get where you are?
I think it's even take it a step further. There hasn't been any open source dev tools company from Nigeria in YC.
Amazing. Good job.
Yeah, thanks. It's quite an interesting story. So when I decided to start working on a startup or to build something, so I just quit my job. I said I wanted to build something. I wasn't sure what I was going to build. And so I started playing around with different tools. I had a Twitter bot at the time. Back then, Twitter APIs were available for everybody. It wasn't stressful
days.
to use.
I remember those.
I mean, I did apply to YC and we didn't get in because I built this sort of API for Nigerian companies to use. And they were like, it's a small market. We don't sort of get it. Try again next time. So what I did was I API and sort of continued to iterate and build several features and sell it into the Nigerian space. And what they started to tell me was, we do not want to pull your API with one webhook. Send us webhooks. We do not want to call your API. I'm like, okay, there has to be like an open source tool that enables me just deploy it in a day and give all these people webhooks. And it turned out there was nothing at the time. Like literally GitHub was empty. I'm like, this is such an abstraction that should be available for everybody. I don't want to write my own signature logic or all this stuff. And then we built the first version, and other YC companies in Nigeria were deploying it to production. And we're like, oh, there's something here. And then we did a pivot. So we went back to YC. We're like, hey, see, you told us what we're working on was not working. But see, we have something new that people are actually using. And they're like, okay, come on in. Yeah, that was literally the story. But what was very clear from the day one was they told us you're building a global company. You're not building a company that was for the Nigerian space alone. And so we just took the global approach from day one.
That's amazing. That is super cool. How has the response been in Nigeria?
Oh, excellent. Excellent. The response has been excellent. We've organized tons of events in Nigeria, sponsored conferences in Nigeria. It's just been awesome. The Nigerian ecosystem, both from the open source side, the event side, everything is awesome. It's excellent.
Were you a sponsor for OSCA this year?
No, we weren't.
But cool. Maybe next year. There's always next year. You can always sponsor OSCA. You can find it. You can Google it. That is super, super cool. Subomi, if you were to give advice to anyone in OSCA or in a developing country, or just anyone with a laptop and an idea, advice as to how to get started and get to an open source business, what would be some things that they should keep in mind? Doesn't have to be the most important advice, but what would you give?
I think the most important advice I would give is validation of the abstractions they think should exist that do exist. Somebody might think, my company in Nigeria or in Kenya or in Tanzania needs this abstraction. But how do I validate that this abstraction is useful for a company in the Bay Area? And you tend to think that it probably exists already if it was a needed problem. And so because it does not exist, nobody needs it. If I thought that for Convoy, we wouldn't be where we are, right? So I think the most important advice I would give anybody in those spaces that the abstractions you think are needed in your organization are most probably needed elsewhere. So open source it and build a community. One of the best things that happened to me in building Convoy is interacting daily with people from different parts of the world. Somebody randomly joins our Slack community and says, hey, I'm from Serbia. I'm trying to deploy Convoy to Azure. I'm like, okay, let's do it. And somebody comes from and says, I'm from Vietnam. I'm trying to deploy Convoy to AWS. I need help. The best part of the job, really.
That is awesome. That is super cool. We're running up on time. Where can people learn more about you and about Get Convoy?
At the moment, I don't have a personal blog. But I don't have a personal blog. So today I blog on Convoy. So you can check it out on Get Convoy. I blog my thoughts on open source companies, everything I'm figuring out about building an open source company as a founder. So yes, getconvoy.io. I think it's been in the show notes. Getconvoy.io. Everywhere I'm Subomi Oluwalana. On Twitter and LinkedIn. That's all.
And that's enough. Thank you so much, Subomi, for coming on. It was really awesome to learn about it. Best of luck with Convoy. I really love that you're taking this from Nigeria, had Nigerian companies and went back and said, no, listen, we already have customers. You should definitely fund us. That is awesome. Great story. Good luck. Hope to see you at the next OSCA.
Thank you so much.